Guyana is our country, our motherland, beautiful and free, and it's here for you and me.
Ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome some of our top performers as they tell us about school. We can learn from our children. Let's show them we can. Let's protect their future. Let's work for a united Guyana. A message from ERC, promoting harmony and good relations.
Before the Supreme Presence, we stand to commend our prayer. In all sincerity, we ask the embrace of our humanity that stands before you in humility, to implore your divine guidance, which has endowed us with the faculties to explore, to understand, and with courage to commence change.
Supreme wisdom, from whose font inspiration has flowed into our imagination and sentient self, to grant us vision and the gift of free choice, be in our midst, guard and guide our cognizance, to rise above restless impulses. Let us be mentored by the spark of enlightenment you have endowed us with.
To embrace this conversation today among men and women from the variations of our young human species,
towards the wisdom and the common truth that we and our world so greatly require.
Bless us with the inspiration of ideals of justice, truth, irrefutable principles, and understanding for an improved and mature nation, and for our better tomorrows.
I pledge myself to honor always
the flag of Guyana,
and to be loyal to my country,
to be obedient to the laws of Guyana,
to love my fellow citizens,
and to dedicate my energies
towards the happiness
and prosperity of Guyana.
Ms. Devika Uditram, a National Youth Awardee and banker by profession, she was awarded Best Graduating Student with a Diploma in Banking and Finance in 2018 from the University of Guyana. Co-facilitating with her this evening is Mr. Travis Bruce. Founder and Vice President of the Sustainable Youth Network, Travis holds many hats in the youth activism sphere, but is also a Community Director and Documentation Solution Supervisor at Brazilio Cobb Associates and a freelance broadcaster at the National Communications Network, Inc. Might I add, these two individuals were former youth parliamentarians who participated in 2015 and 2019 respectively. So we know we're in good hands this evening. Lastly, before I hand over to Devika and Travis, I want to say once more on behalf of the ERC and our partners, thank you for joining us, and always remember, we are many cultures, but one country.
I want to welcome everyone to this virtual National Youth Conversation on bridging the ethnic divide.
The ERC, in collaboration with the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office and the University of Guyana, found a need to host a national conversation to gather information on how we can bridge that gap.
So this evening we will hear from several young people across Guyana as they come from different spaces and their view on how the ethnic relations can be improved across our country. And they represent young people from various ethnicities and socio-economic backgrounds, geopolitical spheres, and genders.
I consider tonight to be one of the most important of discussions that is taking place in our country at this time here, at a time when we decide to talk about race relations and how we can improve same in Guyana. I'm particularly excited about tonight's program because I'm being joined by young people across Guyana, and I've heard it many times, and I'm sure it's almost cliched now, that young people are the changes. We're the one who are going to disrupt those status quo, and we're the one who have been placed with that very difficult task of implementing those changes which we so aspire to see. Young people are the one who are going to change this future. and young people, unfortunately, while at the same time, we have inherited problems of yesteryears from previous generations. But now we have to find ways to addressing same. Sadly, racism has been one that has been inherited, and tonight's discussion is critical to frontally address this scourge. We have the huge task of changing things, and whenever we're being placed in strategic positions in our life to effect these kinds of change, we must not shirk away from our responsibility to effect that of which we want to see. It is easy to complain that this is not right and that is not right, but it obviously takes a willpower and a genuine effort from us to be that change we want to see. I'm sure that you'll agree with me that Guyana is blessed with abundance of resources, but I believe that these resources will become meaningless if we do not address this race issue. And if we do not address them now, we will definitely lose a lot. I have grown up, fortunately, in President's College, an environment that allowed me to interact with youths from across this country and from various backgrounds. And I can tell you what I've learned from that experience. I believe everyone wants the best for Guyana. And because we all want the best for Guyana, we must work towards achieving that goal. Guyana, if we continue to fight because of our difference of our hair, our texture of our hair, our color of our skin, others will come and take away what rightfully belongs to us. This pie that is called Guyana belongs to all of us, and no one must never deny us of this birthright of ours. But we must fix our problem. Today, the ERC mandated under the Constitution to foster these kinds of dialogue. I'm happy that we are on the path of engaging you, and your contributions are obviously very important. We do not know it all. We need everyone's effort. We need everyone's hand on board, because racism and fighting racism must be everyone's business. With that being said, I want to thank those who have availed themselves for tonight's discussion. And I know it's not the first and the last, but the important thing is that this conversation has begun. And I'm sure that after listening and after doing all the talk, we must also recognize that we have a responsibility to put whatever solutions we have into practice. Thank you very much.
Joining us virtually to kickstart this discussion is Ms. Elsie Harry, who is no stranger to these types of engagements. She is the University of Guyana's valedictorian for 2017, an activist, urban planning student, and a Commonwealth youth worker. Ms. Harry, good evening.
Good evening, everyone. First, allow me to thank the ERC for asking me to participate. I will begin with some of the things that I thought about, my perspective on how to improve ethnic relations in Guyana. And my overarching theory is from the perspective that dismantling the anti-Black system will improve ethnic relations in Guyana. And I know when persons hear me say an anti-Black system, they automatically think that I'm only talking about the oppression of African Guyanese. But in terms of the concept of anti-Blackness, there are two contexts, and let me share them with you. Anti-Blackness in its earliest form was manifested in the unproven, baseless theory of a hierarchy of races, beginning with white Europeans at the top and a downward ranking as skin color becomes darker. So essentially, white supremacy. The notion that Caucasian Europeans have a higher level of civilization than other races and therefore are ordained by the Creator to govern civilization and to receive maximum benefits from the resources of the world. If it sounds familiar, it's because this is the notion that supported colonialism and colonization. And that is where the strife began between the various ethnic groups in Guyana in the colonial era. And I'll give you two examples. First, the relationship of strife between the indigenous peoples and the enslaved Africans that were brought to Guyana to work on the plantation, as well as to engage in clearing and building infrastructure. In order to maintain a balance of power in Guyana, the Europeans coerced, and I'm going to use the word coerce because from my readings, it is the notion that I think is most accurate, coerced the indigenous people into returning runaway Africans who were trying to flee the plantations. And this coercion was in the form of ensuring that if they returned the runaway Africans, they would be allowed to live in peace within the forest areas or the hinterland areas. And stories like these are documented in works of various historians. For example, Professor Marjolaine Kars, who we had the opportunity to speak with just last month about the book that she wrote, Blood on the River. And so this relationship of strife that was created between enslaved Africans and the indigenous people is documented, and that's the first relationship of strife that was created. Secondly, the relationship of strife created between Africans and indentured workers. So for those of you who took history will tell you that when enslavement was no longer profitable and emancipation was on the horizon, the planters had to look for a new labor force. And so they created the system. They wrote to their mother nations and requested a system, and they came up with the system of indentureship. And indentureship essentially created a contract of labor for persons from India, Madeira, and China to come to Guyana and to work for meager wages. And in this way, the second relationship of conflict was created because the enslaved Africans, following emancipation, their thought was that they would leave the plantation and they would be able to negotiate the wages that they wanted to be paid because their labor was necessary to keep the plantations going. But now that cheap labor was introduced into the colony, there was no need to negotiate with enslaved Africans because the indentured workers would fill up the labor pool. And so, of course, this started a relationship of strife between the formerly enslaved Africans and the new indentured workers. And this is documented in some readings that I've observed from, for example, Dr. Parvati Ramsaran, who is the professor of humanities at York University. And the title of the piece is The Indentured Contract and Its Impact on Labor Relationship and Community Reconstruction in British Guyana. And I'll read just an excerpt for you. Planters wielded power over the labor market and exploited that division through such legal mechanisms as the indentured contract. That legal document created tension that fueled labor discontent and protests from Blacks whose bargaining power weakened due to the reservoir of contracted labor. So that is the first facet of the discussion that I wanted to begin with, is that the notion of colonialism and colonization is anti-Blackness, and this is the first facet that introduced ethnic strife to Guyanese society as we know it today. The second context in which anti-Blackness is manifested, this was defined by Dr. Kiana Ross, professor of African American Studies at Northwestern University just this year during the height of the Black Lives Matter movement. She said, anti-Blackness describes the inability to recognize Black humanity. It captures the reality that the kind of violence that saturates Black life is not based on any specific thing a Black person did. The violence we experience isn't tied to any particular transgression. It's gratuitous and unrelenting. And this second context of anti-Blackness is directly related to people of African descent specifically, because here is where, even following colonialism, the state continued to perpetuate acts of violence against people of African descent. And of course, people of other races, but I can't accurately speak to the wrongs that were done to persons from other ethnic groups because I've not lived their experiences. So you'll have to forgive me for that bit of it. But in the context of African Guyanese, where this second context of anti-Blackness is manifested, we see that the descendants of formerly enslaved Africans who their ancestors worked on the plantation, and following their free labor on the plantation, they purchased plantations. Those lands, for example, were taken away from the state. Those ancestral lands were taken away from the state, and African Guyanese were disenfranchised in that way by the state. That is the modern state. In terms of the colonial state, they perpetuated several acts of violence against the African Guyanese as well, in terms of flooding their lands and restricting them from purchasing other plantations when they thought that they were purchasing too much land. And this is sharply juxtaposed to the fact that the colonial state gave land to indentured workers to encourage them to stay and to work on the plantations when they realized that there was a possibility that they would want to return to their mother nations. So in terms of anti-Blackness in the context of colonialism and in the context of after-colonialism perpetuated by the state, anti-Blackness has created this relationship of conflict among the ethnic groups in Guyana that is still perpetuated in 2020 Guyana. And this brings me to my next point. The way that the politicians manipulate the wounds of colonialism and ethnic strife that was created during colonialism and immediately after the period of colonialism for political gain. The politicians are acutely aware of the fact that no healing has been done, no reconciliation has been done since the colonial era to talk about some of the relationships of strife that were created. And so during every election cycle, we see that they find subtle ways and sometimes blatant ways to rehash and to rip off the scabs from these old wounds, and they use it to encourage various ethnic groups to be skeptical of each other so that they can get votes without doing the work that is necessary to get votes. Because realistically, we're supposed to be voting based on the policies that they put forward, based on the character of the person, but the politicians have found an easier way to secure their votes. And it is my opinion that the state has not done enough to repair these wounds so that they cannot be exploited for political gain. For example, it is the responsibility of the state to have conversations, honest conversations about what transpired during the colonial era and to write an accurate history of what transpired, of what each ethnic group suffered according to their perspective. When this is written, of course, there needs to be consensus on it, and that might be a difficult thing to achieve, but we've got to try, because once an accurate account of what has transpired has been written, then persons can begin themselves to make it, as well as the state can begin to make amends for it. I must say that the early state following following independence, tried to have some sort of national unity. And the only thing is they tried to do this without discussing what caused the fault lines along the ethnic groups. So for example, in 1961, Elder UC GUYANA suggested that there should be a shared premiership between Dr. Cheddi Jagan and Mr. Burnham. Dr. Jagan at the time, he was he was opposed to this thought, as well as Burnham was opposed to this thought, because both of them thought that they had enough ethnic votes to secure the government on their own. In 1962, Dr. Jagan proposed a coalition government, but Mr. Burnham opposed to this. And back and forth they went until in 1985, when the PNC was in government, Burnham tried and significant unity talks ensued. And I've been reading this book. It's called National Reconciliation and National Unity. And this documents the process, and it's written by Halim Majid, who is still alive, by the way. He's our ambassador in Cuba, and he talks about some of the attempts made at reconciling the two major ethnic groups. But one of the things that I've noted, and that I think that we need to pay attention to, is the fact that during all of these procedures of trying to arrive at a government of national unity, no one is taking the time to talk about what caused the faults among the various ethnic groups to begin with, which went all the way back to colonialism. And so, even though it seemed to be moving along in 1985, when Burnham died, it essentially died with him because President Hoyt had no interest in this. And of course, within the PPP fraction, Janet Jagan had no interest in this for their own reasons. But I believe that had there been some consensus on the wrongs that had been done, and people could acknowledge those wrongs by talking about what created those faults, then people would be more inclined to stick out the course and to talk about how national unity would be better for Guyana. And so it brings me to present day. I believe that you have to dismantle the anti-Black system that stratifies us according to color and determines our worth based on our skin color. 2, reconsider shared governance or shared government if persons prefer that terminology. But there has to be a conversation had first about what caused the problems in the first place, and an accurate account of that documented as the basis that we're having this conversation on, because without consensus, you can make an agreement and that agreement will fall through. And 3, because this is a forum created by the Ethnic Relations Commission has got to do its work. This national conversation is fantastic, but also the Ethnic Relations Commission has to be empowered, and perhaps the legislation will have to be revised to empower them to attach sanctions to the acts that do not augur well for smooth ethnic relations in Guyana, beyond asking people to apologize. Also, the persons who work in the commission have to be held to the same standards, because if they breach their own code of conduct, then ordinary citizens will not listen to them in any case. And finally, in terms of the legislation, I was reading the Ethnic Relations Commission's legislation, and I saw that they had to make recommendations to the cabinet to have certain things done. But what if it's the members of the cabinet that are being sanctioned? How can you sanction the person that has to approve the sanction? So basically, Guyana has not made a serious attempt to solve the problem with ethnic relations in Guyana, because the legislation goes around in circles, and the attempts that we have made have not started from the root of the problem. So that is essentially what I was trying to do with giving you all of that information. Thank you so much.
Mr. Kyle Joseph. Mr. Kyle Joseph has always been actively engaged in youth spaces representing indigenous youth. He was the UN Volunteer Youth Advocate for Monitoring and Evaluation from 2018 to 2020 and worked closely with indigenous villages across the Rupununi. Currently, he works with the South Rupununi District Council as a project coordinator, working to improve the livelihoods of indigenous communities. Welcome this evening, Mr. Joseph.
I'm from Aishalton village in the South Rupununi, and I started schooling in Aishalton. I then went on to Georgetown to continue my studies. And I spent a number of years there. And so I've been back and forth between Georgetown life and the Rupununi life. And I think that I've had a good opportunity to see, what kinds of differences there are in the life that we live. And I think it really gave me an idea of how much Indigenous people were left behind. I think it put me at a space where in town I saw, these are all the opportunities that young people, adults and young people had in along the coast, not only Georgetown, but the things that were lost to the Indigenous people all across the hinterland. Still simple things like your health access, the access to education, the social interactions, the mere playgrounds that you may have along the coast. These things were just not available. And what it told me as a young Indigenous person was that who cares about what it is that we have access to. It seemed very unequal to me, and something that told me that the racism or the race relations went beyond just the casual racism, the street racism. It was all there in government policies, how the government saw us. I think it informed how the government treated us. I know I was given a very short time to prepare for this, but in thinking of what I wanted to say here tonight, a reading came to mind, or a reading I was reminded about was that Elsie would have touched a bit on this, about the history of Guyana and how it informed where we are today, was that we came from a place of colonization, the white man, taking care of the Indigenous people. The Indigenous people were people to be taken care. They need to be taken care of. And I think that transitioned over time to when that changed, when we became a republic, when we became our own nation. Now two major ethnic groups took over that position, right? It felt very much as though like the Indigenous people were those who needed to be taken care of. You go into the villages, you give them small developmental things here and there. I'm not saying I'm not grateful for all of the things that any administration has done. I'm just saying it doesn't necessarily seem like something that was long term, something that was well thought out. Our infrastructure is still the same as it was 20 years ago, right? How can that be called including Indigenous communities in this nationwide development? It doesn't feel like that. It feels like we're being left behind. And that in itself, it changes how people see us, right? Because when when ministers go into Indigenous communities, they take their pictures, they post it on Facebook, and they post it on their government sites. To the rest of the casual man walking on the street in Barbase, he thinks, okay, these Indigenous people have everything. They're only catering to these Indigenous people. They have their own ministry, right? How then is that going to affect how other people see Indigenous people? I experienced this firsthand at school. Even if it was my friends, even if it was a joke, there's always mention, oh, you always need help, right? And so I think it informs. You may think that this is something that is only at government and policy level, but it informs the kind of relations that we have with each other, and how the other races see us as Indigenous people. I think that that being just one aspect, something that I definitely wanted to touch on, and how Indigenous people, and especially Indigenous women, are perceived anywhere across Guyana, was just how they're treated. How am I to say this? The hypersexualization of Indigenous women was I think something that highlights how differently we're seen. Often Indigenous women are sexualized by persons from the coast. When they come into our communities, they see us differently. They see you as someone who's timid. And this speaks directly to my own experience as well. You're seen very timid, someone who can be taken advantage of. And I think this is, as I mentioned, this trickles down from the policy level. I think while we're talking about this as well, it's important to know, I know that I'm making it seem as though Indigenous people are never in the wrong, but that is absolutely not the case, because many Indigenous communities are often isolated. I think that Indigenous people themselves have their own perception of others, of other races, of people coming into their community, and that is a conversation that needs to happen in Indigenous communities as well, to improve the kind of relations that they have with the other groups in Guyana. And I think to sort of start that conversation, which is why we're here. I say all of that to say, while we're here, how do we start to improve? How do we start to improve the race relations? So one of the very more important things is always having Indigenous people included in the spaces where we're having this discussion. I'm not sure if it's by chance or what it is that I was so late to be invited to this meeting, but that in itself was something that I was not happy with. We should always be included, make the effort. I know you think that Indigenous people live far, they don't have the best internet, but if you don't make that effort, then what are you really doing? And I know the widespread conversation that we're having right now, this is important, yes. Having this conversation with Elsie, with Derwayne, with whoever else is about to speak, that is important. But what about the common man in the street, the people who don't have access to internet, who won't have access to Facebook? How are we getting to them? And I think Elsie mentioned it. We need to have that, the mandate of ERC needs to be updated, so that you don't just do this, you do more than that. You go into the schools, you go into communities. I think, as we all know here, it's very important, and it forms our politics, it informs our relations, our casual street relations, as I want to say. And if we are to go anywhere else in Guyana, if we want to do any other sort of development, I think talking about that is paramount. I think it is my opinion that is the most important thing to talk about in Guyana. And I know Derwin, kind of, not too personally, but at one time I did have a conversation with him, and he made me think deeply about what other places were doing on the topic of race relations. What are we doing to heal? What are we doing to reconcile with each other? And I think we can do more than just Facebook calls. I know it may seem corny to some of you who are listening, but we do need more messages on TV, on the radio, that speaks to the kind of relations that we have now, that confronts it. We don't just sit back and tiptoe around the kind of words we use, the kind of derogatory words that we use. We need to say that is wrong. I don't think to this day I've never heard a minister talk about the kind of derogatory language that just flings across the street, across Facebook, social media platforms. I've never once heard someone come out to condemn that. And that, I think, as well, is something that we need to discuss. What are the... I know this may seem very funny, but I'm very much concerned about how do I address someone who's African, Black, Indian, East Indian, Amerindian, Indigenous, which is an entire conversation by itself, of why the Ministry of now Amerindian Affairs was renamed Amerindian Affairs, but I won't get into that. But I think that speaks to what kind of respect are you giving to the people if you're not willing to listen to the small requests, the small name changes. And I thought about how this isn't only true for Indigenous people. This is true for all the races. That sense of creating a space of comfort for everyone. I know that maybe some African people, some East Indian people may not feel comfortable going into spaces that is not their own. An African man may not feel, comfortable walking in an East Indian community or even in an Indigenous community. And that in itself, it talks about what feelings we have in ourselves and how we think other people perceive and see us, right? Because we don't feel that comfort. I think we need to address that. making Guyana a safe space. Guyana is a safe space only in small pockets. You can feel safe in your own pockets, but if you go beyond that, sometimes you may seem a bit out of place, a bit awkward. And I think Guyana, we need to get that to that place where Guyana is safe wherever we go. It's about building that respect. It's about building an understanding of our cultural differences. It's about, not only we know that there are different races. There's sure. Oh,
Hi,
sorry.
Mr. Joseph.
Getting a feedback.
Sorry to interrupt. Is it possible if you can wrap up in about 3 minutes?
Oh, I was gonna do it in one. But yes.
Okay, sure.
And so it's and so in doing so, I know a lot of people would say, okay, we get to a place where we don't see race. I don't necessarily agree with that notion. I think we should respect, our cultural differences, respect the races. People often like to say we shouldn't see color. I don't think that's the case. I think we should learn to see that color and embrace that color difference, and embrace all our differences as Guyanese people. We celebrate our diversity. We should at least act as though we embrace that diversity. And this has been my one piece. So thank you very much for this space, and thank you for everyone else who has been listening. And I hope we move forward in this discussion.
That was indeed very informative. Wanting viewers, Mr. Joseph is joining us all the way from region number 9. So thank you for taking the time off to spend with us. We have one question from our Zoom chat here. From Ms. Raquel Thomas. She spoke of a friend from the hinterlands who faced racism. While things appear to have improved in Guyana, Kyle, what are your views on this? Has the situation improved or has it remained the same?
Oh, that's an excellent question. I think we often like to think that we've gone a very far way in how Indigenous people are created, how Indigenous people are seen. Sorry. I think it has. I would not like to discredit all maybe the improvement we've made, but it's not a lot. I have to say it's not a lot. There has been improvement, but very small, and I think we have bigger steps to take.
Thank you, and I will agree with Saeed as well. Race relations engagements require strategic grassroots level communication. That is indeed very important, and open dialogue. So thank you very much for joining us, Mr. Joseph.
There's actually one more to him from Saeed.
Oh, one more question, Kyle, from Saeed once again. The Amrinin Act is laced with several avenues whereby the subject minister maintains dominion over indigenous peoples. Example, through vetoing a VC refusal for large-scale mining or overturning certain VC decisions. What are your thoughts on legislative amendments, and are you familiar with any work in this regard?
Yes, I'm reading the comment. While I admit that my work, working along with village councils and how they relate to government is fairly new, so I wouldn't want to, pretend as though I have an answer for that. But it is my understanding that there needs to be a lot of change there. I think, for the most part, we want to think that villages are in control of their land, are in control of their own people, but that's just not the case. It's proudly championed, that, okay, indigenous people have land, they can do this, they can do that, but it is that ease at which that governments can quickly overturn that just, it undermines everything. It undermines the power that indigenous people have. And I think that's, if we are going to begin to respect indigenous people and their own decisions, that's the sort of legislation that needs to change.
Thank you. Saeed, I hope that answers your question in the Zoom chat.
Great. Balance up. All right. Well, first and foremost, I'd like to thank the ERC for inviting me onto this forum. I think it's one of the most critical issues that we have to look deeper into and find resolutions for. Racism is something that we see across the world and is always on the news. And I think this is an opportunity for a society, and I always like to refer back to the size of Guyana society and the size of our population as an issue that we can tackle very effectively and efficiently, providing we have the right tools. So far, I think this forum has been amazing. I was following it a bit this morning. And I think we've all gotten an amazing cultural history lesson, listening to a diverse group of people speak about their experiences and the history. And I think this has given Guyanese a good opportunity to expand on a lot of ideas that we can use to end racism. My presentation, though, is going to be a little bit more solution-based. I'm going to come up with a few examples and ideas that we have, and the correct way for us to go about using these tools and these ideas will be very largely based on data collection. I actually, funny enough, I listened to Mr. Hughes on his presentation this morning, and I know it was very, very based on the necessary, the need for data collection and for us to get a true picture of how racism is affecting us here in Guyana. So the primary issue that I'm looking at today, and we're all kind of basing our ideas on, is the perception that there's an inequality amongst races in Guyana. So the solution to this needs to be first addressing this perception that racism exists in Guyana. And the foundation of that perception is being explored through forums like this very often these days. It is a solid belief that this perception is real, that is causing groups of citizens to see each others as enemies rather than the intellectual authors of these divisions. So where do I go and why am I saying this? We end up in a very politically contentious country, as we've seen throughout our history. And I think the first thing, again, we need to explore is the role of politicians. And in our society, it should be and is the idea of promoting unity. A big part of that is the responsibility involves resisting the temptation to frame every issue as one under the umbrella of race. And this becomes very evident when we look at examples throughout our maybe even very recent history. And to be very blunt about my examples, I mean, you have the Gary Best and Jude Bentley versus the Henry Boys murder and the reaction towards that. This conversation is very largely based around, in everyday society, that the value of one's life is not necessarily as important as the others. So how come we didn't have the same reaction? And this is one of the ideas that I'm using as an example to show that the political role of racism in Guyana and who it affects and how it benefits them. So before we can conclude that racism is systemic, we need to establish clear indicators of discrimination. So, for example, we would need to do a little bit more data-driven analysis on contracts that are awarded both by the private and public sector. Unless this data is generated comprehensively, then we can never really understand the extent and the depth of the problem here. We have a lot of ideas when it comes to what we feel and all experience on a daily basis in Guyana, but in reality, unless we have the analytics behind that, unless we can see the clear impact that it's having on our society, then how do we go about putting systems in place to right the wrongs, to fix the flaws? And this is something that I think we need to start assessing a little bit more as we go on. For example, this data has to be very accurate and complete. Another example of why this data is very important is because we can't go about, for example, saying that the Iflut, Gaisuko Iflut estate hires more predominantly Indo-Guyanese, so that makes them racist. That's not realistic. Or, for example, in Linden, the bauxite industry hires more predominantly Afro-Guyanese, that's not realistic, again, to call them racist because of the environments that they're in, because of the aspects of society that everyone is engaged in when it comes to these businesses. So, sorry, allow me to run through my notes as we go along here, because this is a very, I don't want to say touchy topic, but we're trying to have a very frank conversation, and we need to make sure we articulate this over properly so everybody can understand clearly that we are always going to be here for the betterment, and the ideas are not necessarily to attack, but to come up with creative and accurate solutions. So, another aspect of data being necessary is that the government's role for creating policy, right? This is measuring the effectiveness of that implementation of such policy as well, and using it to campaign, and people also having the opportunity to assess these governments and these organizations in whether or not they are being effective and actually putting these measures forward in reality. So some of these examples are balancing the police force and recruitment strategies to encourage diversity. This is a very important aspect, and it can build a sense of quasi-confidence when it comes to fairness. It's only natural human nature. So we need to start exploring a little bit more in depth on how we are going to allow, on how we are going to create a society that has more balance and is, and we put policy forward to ensure that balance exists. The next big aspect of combating racism is education on ethnic and race relations. I've had a wonderful time here listening to the presenters, some of my colleagues here that have been very, very articulate and very, very accurate in assessing the effects that racism throughout history has had on Guyana and where it may have stemmed from. Again, being in the 21st century that we are, we do have to start assessing, we do have to start understanding that in order for us, again, to implement any of the necessary changes that are being put forward here, and ideas and concepts, we have to, at some point, understand the analytics are critical. The information that is gathered is the only way we will be able to accurately implement the systems needed to affect the change. So, as I move on. All right. I'm gonna give a few more examples here as to where statistic-based driven can help in some major areas in society and why it's necessary. So, for example, the stigma regarding young Afro-Guyanese young Afro-Guyanese men in crime. This is not a unique issue in Guyana, but the reality is before we get systems in place like rehabilitation programs, like addressing crime in depressed states, and the cycle that continues, how can we do that without having accurate information as to where and if these problems actually exist? So we can easily feed into a racist narrative when in actual fact, this may not be the problem at all, and that's our major issue here in Guyana. All right, again, getting back, a lot of this is based on where our political leaders are going to take information and set systems up to gather the necessary information to enact the change. We've watched a lot over history. We've watched a lot of conversations on a daily basis with regards to the impact and the reality of racism in Guyana. But again, at no point in time has any of our current leaders taken an active step to get the information necessary to prove that it exists or not. And a large part of this, is to be very frank, as we're having our frank conversation, is we're worried. I'm sure when I say we, the organizations and the politicians in power are worried about the results of that. And us living every day to understand this and living on the road and you know, dealing with people on a daily basis, understand that racism is something that we feel exists. Why not have it down on paper, prove it, and allow systems to be put in place to right the wrongs? Another good example here is the domestic violence and suicide rate, especially here in Guyana. There's a stigma that this problem resides predominantly among Indo-rural Guyanese communities. For persons who have been married at a young age, there could be involved with alcohol, and these again are just assumptions that we have made, not actually accurately analyzed. We need scientific studies to determine whether these issues exist and their demographic, so we can implement programs to assist. This carries me into another very interesting aspect of my presentation here. And it has a lot to do with the next step that comes after, because we have to get all our ducks in a row. We have to ensure that if we're setting a process up, we have an end goal in mind as to what we need. And part of that is penalties, is understanding that if we're implementing systems to end racism, it would mean for people that have decided to ignore these systems and these policies put in place, there need to be repercussions for those actions. And as we've seen again throughout history, you end up in a position of many, many people going about, whether it's slanderous, racist remarks in the political sphere, or whether it's on social media, as we've come up more regularly with the Times. The reality is, what are the penalties for breaking these policies? I actually, I listened to another presenter this morning who made mention that we have three policies that are set out right now for reprimanding those that may be perceived to be racist. And she had mentioned that up to date, there had never been any convictions when it came to people putting forward racist rhetoric. And the reality is, if that's the case, then either one, our penalties don't exist or are flawed, or two, our systems are clearly not strong enough. So getting back to the idea of statistics-based analysis. Great. 5 more minutes. I think organizations such as the ERC, for example, should be given a lot more scope when it comes to allowing them to do this analysis on Guyanese and in our societies, and also enabling them to have, conduct investigations more into it, kind of broadening their powers and their scope. We have to discourage tokenism within our societies, where people are only occupying strategic positions based on race and merit. And these are ideas that organizations like the ERC need to be able to investigate and act upon, providing these are the correct situations and the reality of the situations. So just to conclude very quickly, as I'm almost done here, scientific approach to finding these issues in society, exploring, this requires expert interventions through analysis, using statistics done by organizations internationally and locally. I think that's a big part of what we need to start understanding as such a small society. There's nothing wrong with asking for some help. These are issues that people are dealing with across the world. To reach out into the international community, to ask for help with these kind of issues can always be beneficial, as again, Guyana's being as young as we are, facing a lot of these problems for the first time. And again, being, just independent for just over 50 years now. All right? And lastly, the government and the private sector need to be issued a report card as an idea on these type of issues, something to start the statistics analysis. Be given the opportunity to produce report cards based on their diversity yearly, so the nation can see how they've performed. And this goes very largely, again, for the government and the public sector, and to show how they are actively pursuing being diverse and showing an inclusive type systematic approach when it comes to ending the racial division here in Guyana, or the perceived racial division here in Guyana. And that is it for me. Thank you.
So Kian, specifically to you, this question comes from Kwesi Grant, and he says, how do we address the racial or ethnic stigma and stereotypes that do exist? He said we do not need data collection that proves that they exist, or do we? So can you respond to that question for Kwesi Grant?
All right. I think it's a good question. Because the reality is we do have social stigmas. In society, we are all aware, we've all grown up in Guyana, we have all dealt with our fair share of racism. And I think that's a very important aspect of understanding the stigmas, is that we all experience it. And I can, I'm sorry, whether you're Indo-Guyanese, Afro-Guyanese, whether you're Chinese Guyanese, whether you're Portuguese Guyanese, whatever your mix is, and as the previous presenter has said, we tend to put each other in these boxes and tick them off, not understanding that we are all, we all have a cultural background. But what happens is dealing with the social side of these stigmas and people's perceptions becomes very difficult to rectify, to create solutions for dealing with, if we again don't have that particular data that's necessary for the social programs to be created. So how exactly do I go about educating those in society when I don't have the correct data and statistics to know exactly who is being affected and where and how? These are all questions that need to be asked even before we can start educating. And this always ends up being our problem, right? We need to start becoming more analytical. It has a lot less to do with just looking at somebody and educating them on what we believe are their stereotypes and issues, what we believe are their stereotypes and issues. But at the end of the day, we have to start becoming more data-driven in order to get those programs implemented and in order to find out the direct root and cause of these mentalities and behavioral patterns.
Boise, I hope that answered your question. Kian, before you move on, we have another question. This is coming from Trevor Baggyrat, who is joining us on Facebook. If you were faced with a situation where you had to deal with a racist person who is from the same party as you, political party, how would you deal with such a situation?
That's an interesting question. So, firstly, I'd like to believe that anybody joining an organization as the one I am a part of would hopefully understand before they get involved the ideologies of the organization. And one of the main platforms of a new and united Guyana is to end racism in Guyana with a proposal, again, a proposal of shared governance. It's an idea that we platformed and campaigned on in the recent election. It is one of the proposed solutions, starting of one of the proposed solutions that we had. So if there happened to be a racist person in our organization, I would probably just try and educate them that might not necessarily be the right mentality, but all are welcome and hopefully join with an open mind. And I want to believe that our organization is one of which anybody can come in with their ideas their ideas and concepts, and we can work together in order to mold something that'll be beneficial to all of Guyana, because at the end of the day, all the opinions do matter, and we need to understand and take experiences and feed off of each other in order to create a holistic picture of moving Guyana forward.
It was with great pleasure that I introduce our next speaker, as they answer the question also how we can improve the ethnic relations in Guyana, none other than Mr. Derwin Wills. And Derwin is an extremely concerned Guyanese, and he has worked in human and community development programs across Guyana, and was trained in sociology at the University of the West Indies. And Derwin currently serves in an advisory capacity on the National Steering Committee and the Civil Society Reference Group of the Spotlight Initiative for Guyana. So Derwin, it's over to you for your presentation this evening.
Thank you also to the Ethnic Relations Commission and to the panelists who were before me, not just in the youth conversation, but also the panelists who were in the Big People conversation earlier. But it's always good to be referred to as a youth, even though I'm slowly but surely aging out of this bracket, now entering the space of being a big youth. When I consider these conversations about race and race relations and racism in Guyana, it always boils down because we will always have a conversation about how it manifests in our political system and in our electoral system. Distribution of resources, ideas of insecurity, especially these ethnic senses of these ethnic insecurities, and this is a conversation that came up a little bit earlier. But when I try to disaggregate the ways in which the system manifests throughout our space that is Guyana, I try to use an ecosystem model that sort of breaks things down at 4 levels: at an ideological level, at an institutional level, at an interpersonal level, and at an individual level. So for the ideological, it's more about understanding this broad idea of racism and how it really informs almost everything that we do, including how we trust people, but also including how our laws and policies, etc., are passed. At the institutional level, we look at how the things are cemented into words and into actions that are publicly funded in most cases. And then at the interpersonal level, you're going to talk about the big auntie at the corner shop who probably don't like you because you think she's a racist. And at the individual level, we think about how we internalize certain ideas about our racial groups, etc. But even in understanding race and race relations and racism in Guyana, there's 3 questions that I always use when I try to understand discrimination. And those questions are: 1, who has power? 2, who doesn't have power? And 3, how is power used by people who have it against people who don't? And this always helps me to ground almost everything that is happening around me so I could think through more clear analysis, and also to position what are the solutions. How we understand race relations and racism as a country is integral to shaping our steps. And I say steps intentionally because it's supposed to be plural. Moving forward, because uprooting this system requires a restructuring not only of behaviors, but also of the laws which cement discriminatory practices. And so when we think about the state of affairs in Guyana, for as long as we've been alive or for as long as we've been politically conscious, I want us to think about these ideas about how power manifests, who has it, who doesn't have it, and how it is used by people who have it against people who don't. In my research on this particular topic, I'm always looking for new research, and I was really grateful to come across the work of Dr. Dwayne Edwards. And for those persons who know Dwayne Edwards, Dwayne is a Guyanese sociologist currently attached to UWI. And he presented a paper called Corruption and State Capture Under 2 Regimes in Guyana, a Plural Society Approach. And so in this paper, he argues that in understanding Guyana's corruption index, and I'll explain a little bit later on why I'm starting off this conversation here with corruption, in understanding Guyana within the context of ethnic insecurity. In understanding Guyana's corruption index ranking, the difficulty of scholars and opinion shapers was in adequately labeling the phenomenon. He focused on the history of the PNC government pre-1992, as well as the PUP government up to 2015. And so Dwayne Edwards' work was very thorough. He uses three summaries of what he tried to understand, how it is that corruption manifests. And he says, Freddie Kissoon labels it as electoral dictatorship, which to capture the conflicting modus operandi of the government as having all the trappings of a democratic state, but still considered dictatorial because of the subverting of the constitution and aspects of political life. And when we think about how we feel, insecure in the space as various ethnic groups, we must think about how certain issues have popped up, even as ethnic issues, but for which these issues have constantly come out as us trying to constantly reassure the need to uphold the Constitution, issues relating to local government elections, issues relating to dual citizenship in the National Assembly, and even issues relating to Article 13 of the Constitution, which speaks more specifically to governance, which is a concept that persons are still trying to grasp, but have not in some cases entirely grasped. And, just for the sake of the knowledge, Article 13 is really and about governance and why it's different from shared government. Article 13 says that the principal objective of the political system, and that's why it's so powerful, because it says the principal objective of the political system is to create opportunities. And when I hear the political system, I'm not only thinking about central government, but I'm also thinking about the regional government and the local government. So the principal objective of the political system is to create opportunities for the involvement of persons within the society to be part of the decision-making processes, especially about those decisions that affect their lives and their well-being. Sorry about that. So even in the way in which we shape our society, in the way in which we shape relations among ourselves, and how we feel as though, we're being underrepresented. Article 13 is a powerful example of how we can really start to think about creating a more holistic society where everybody's views are taken into consideration. And you don't actively have to be involved in a political party to do so, because Article 13 seems to appeal more to civil society involvement. And Dwayne also argues that Troy Thomas describes the criminalized state to highlight the link between the state and the criminal world, while he says that Kemraj Ramjatan moves beyond the conceptual and highlights the historical, legislative, and ethnic dynamics which provided the enabling environment exploited by the ethno-political elite. And I like it that he mentions the ethno-political elite, because it grounds it not just in a race-ethnic conversation, but also in a conversation about class, about ideas of the ruling class, and about people who are basically just navigating the space. And so for Dwayne, the state therefore is used by ethnic groups as a means through which both economic and political power can be attained and exercised, with the latent function of enhancing the socio-economic position of the ethnic group in a socio-economic stratification system. So think about the political parties that we choose to vote for and why we choose to vote for them. We're always having these conversations about making sure we vote on issues, but we constantly have, at least what we're seeing, people are voting based on race. And so there's these ideas of ethnic insecurity, which are not unfounded, because we have seen instances where political parties have weaponized the state against peoples. So every election cycle, you see these insecurities sort of manifest within our society. And so Dwayne says the nature of this battle for power creates an environment of uncertainty, which serves as a pressure upon the ethnic group in power to accumulate wealth. And this is where it gets so interesting, because he's still talking about corruption. To accumulate wealth as much economic resources by both legitimate and illegitimate means before its hold on political power comes to an end. And you must think about how limited, and I know persons in the electoral reform have been, there have been persons who've asked for a sort of a restructuring of our entire system, because politicians usually see themselves in 5-year cycles, because that's how elections is set up. And so for many things that we have, persons have been concerned that the national development, the human development for Guyana has not existed on a continuity, because you find things have always been disrupted and restarted, because politicians always see, in these 5-year cycles. So now that we've laid sort of like this, try to understand a little bit how corruption is or exists as a sort of an ethnic performance, and more specifically, a performance for, preservation of particular ethnic groups, especially those ethnic groups that feel as though they're more represented in power. I want to shift the narrative a little bit to talk about public procurement, because earlier in the conversation, persons were, and I mean, this is a comment that was made, so it's not entirely my own words, that was saying that, there are things that we aspire to. We aspire to better relations and so on. But there are also things that we have to look at a more institutional level to really understand what are the hardened manifestations of racism, or even these potentials for creating racial tensions that exist within the society, as they are sort of enshrined within our laws already. And so in my understanding of public procurement now, what does it really mean for persons at the bottom? Recognizing that public procurement has the power to direct monies into communities long underrepresented in public procurement practices, basically just government contracts. And also that marginalized communities' participation in public procurement has the potential to lift persons, families, and communities out of poverty. So when we're talking about the distribution of very limited resources within the Guyanese context, and how it is that the political system and political parties come to sort of weaponize that distribution to limit it to only the groups that support them. And you always talk about, people who get roads and people who get house lots and so on. This is all that we're talking about, that sort of pulled together in the same thing. So as a manifestation, in examining public procurement in Guyana and contractors pool by race, by class, by capital, by gender, what would it really reveal? Like, how would we really understand ourselves if we looked at the contracting pool that accesses government contracts, and we interrogate issues of race and class and capital and gender? What would it really say about us? As a manifestation of corrupt race ethnic practices, friends and family are overwhelmingly, in some cases, given government contracts through sole source justifications and other means, which reduces the meritocracy in the process. But the meritocracy is still near impossible when the procurement pool is laced with contractors who in some cases have benefited from practices of inequality that compete against smaller contractors and win. So on September 3, Kaichur News published a story, and this is where I'm going to use a little bit of an anecdote for this. Kaichur News published a story with the headline, City Youth Protest for Cleanup Contracts, where the newspaper noted that more than 60 young men from Lane Avenue, Sideline Dam, Albistown, Alexander Village, and Riverview are calling to be prioritized for contracts to clean up their neighborhoods and the Lerpentier Cemetery. The article went on to note that in 2014, the PPP government had signed an $8.3 million contract with Jeffrey James Construction for debushing the cemetery. And that in 2018, the mayor of Georgetown, well, it's either the mayor of Georgetown, I don't know, I don't think that's too accurate, spent $100 million each year to keep the cemetery clean, with an MNCC spokesperson boasting as well that it had signed a contract with Chung's Global Enterprise. Now, how does that really how does that really sort of trickle down when we think about very limited resources and how these resources could have been benefiting these racialized communities that have been long underrepresented? And when I say racialized communities, I also mean Black communities as well, because the areas that were previously identified, in some cases, were predominantly Black. How is it that public procurement presents that potential for us to trickle down resources from the state to these average persons on the ground? Now, it is not to say that there have not been efforts previously. And these are the things that also need to be acknowledged, but we need to also continue the path. There have been efforts to make the public procurement process more equitable. And I use equity very deliberately because equity and equality are two separate concepts. And we sometimes, use them interchangeably. I think.
Yes. Sorry, Darwin. I'm just asking if you can wrap up in about 4 minutes, if possible.
And so the provincial administration had amended the Procurement Act to allow for 20% of state contracts to be accessible by small businesses. Now, this didn't just happen just like that. There was still some conflict in between the legislation, because you had a Small Business Act that basically said, 20% of government contracts probably should go to small businesses, but this was not in line with the Procurement Act. And so when we think about, who really constitutes small businesses, which particular group maybe could benefit from small business, I'm not going to assume this, but I'm going to say, and this is a point that I was going to raise later on, that we need to secure, and these are, conversations that came up with previously, secure more data in understanding how it is that different race, ethnic groups are represented throughout our society, in terms of access to resources, access to capital, representation on state boards, even things like representation in elected offices, including at the local government levels. And this is where I feel the ethnic relations has a very important role. And this, of course, is going to not really add to their mandate, because they already have a very ambitious mandate, but sort of in the actualizing of their mandate, engage in more aggressive data collection exercises, where they also advocate for aggressive data collection approaches to central government, and for this information to become more open source. So it's actively out there in the public. And the final thing I will say, just a quick recommendations: to use data to broadly understand the distribution of political and economic power across race and ethnic groups, as per the recommendation of Nigel Hughes previously. This was a fantastic recommendation. Use data to more specifically disaggregate criminal prosecution, success of judicial action, government contracts, distribution by race. And this is specifically a charge to the Ethnic Relations Commission. And Ravidev had mentioned very importantly, ethnic impact assessments. And I would advocate aggressively for adopting these ethnic impact assessments for legislation and government policies, etc. And I would also want for us to expand the national census, particularly the section that relates to race, to allow people to identify a little bit more with different race groups. Because if people look at me, they're going to say Black. But at the same time, I might choose to identify with other race groups and recognize my ancestry. Maybe I want to identify with my Portuguese ancestry. Maybe I want to identify with my Chinese ancestry. But if you're going to look at people and just tick off, then that really limits the way in which we understand race, especially race mixing, race miscegenation within the Guyanese context. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Darwin, for your presentation.
Our next presenter is young and upcoming journalist Ms. Vashani Raghubir. Ms. Raghubir was awarded in 2019 by the Guyana Press Association Young Journalist of the Year accolade. She is currently pursuing her Bachelor's of Science degree in Leadership and Management at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus. Ms. Raghubir, we welcome you to our forum this evening.
Good night, everyone. Protocols already established. Just allow me to say good night. You heard from Elsie, Kyle, and Derwin, and I mentioned them in particular because they're people I know personally, and I'm happy that they were able to share here tonight. And you also heard from Mr. Kian Jabor. Tonight, I'm not necessarily here with a well-researched presentation ready to like spit some facts. I'm actually here to emphasize that I don't know what is the right way forward. But that's not a bad thing because I intend to sprinkle in some honesty and hopefully convince you all that community dialogue is a crucial component on the roadmap to fostering solidarity and harmony. Quick thing before I actually begin, and I noted this from the presentations this morning, I am an Indo-Guyanese. I grew up in an Indo-Guyanese family, and I'm from a predominantly Indo-Guyanese community, but that doesn't mean that the sentiments I express here tonight are reflective of all young Indo-Guyanese women. These are my experiences and my thoughts. So right, back to basics. I've seen, heard, and experienced learned prejudice, stereotypes, biases about my Indo-Guyanese experiences, about my Indo-Guyanese identity, sorry. And I have either been in spaces that have perpetuated these, or I myself have perpetuated these, whether knowingly or unknowingly. And I personally feel that acknowledging these things forms part of my efforts to unlearn the bad and try to open myself up again to learning. This year while I was in Trinidad at the UE, I looked on at the things that were happening here in Guyana on social media, and it made me really sad, just sad, because it was just interesting. This was my first exposure to elections, more or less, because of my age, where I could understand it at least. And it was just sad to see how ethnic disharmony could be fueled so easily. Fortunately or unfortunately, Trinidad also held their elections this year in August. And I saw the same kind of racial, ethnic rhetoric emerge, and obviously that made me think about Guyana. And then, this year also, the Black Lives Matter movement was also very prominent, and for some reason all of these experiences kind of compelled me to reach out to my family members and honestly just try to have certain conversations with them. Simple conversations about things like the biases and the perceptions that I grew up hearing and maybe learning about. And definitely, as you can imagine, these conversations were uncomfortable and intense. But more and more, what it made me realize was that in my family, we never really had conversations like these. We never really had that space to express these sentiments and really interrogate whether we may have been stereotyping an entire group for the experience we might have had with one person, for example. These conversations aren't finished. They're still happening, and they're important conversations that I believe I will probably continue with for a long, long time, possibly for the rest of my life, who knows. But it really emphasized that, you know, these conversations are necessary because, again, we need to unlearn the bad. And I've been writing about these experiences, the experiences with the conversations with my family in my weekly column at the Guyana Chronicle, and I rather suspect that's part of why I'm here today. And many times, persons would message me, email me, because I include my email at the end of my column, and they would say something defensive like, oh, an Afro-Guyanese does this, or Indo-Guyanese people does do this, and I don't doubt that, right? I don't doubt that for a second. I believe that Guyanese people, whether Indo, Afro, Indigenous mix, Chinese, Portuguese, etc., Guyanese people in general have experienced real pain and trauma. And that's not just because of this year and because the elections and the occurrences for this year. I just believe that we've had experiences that are pretty terrible. Really traumatic experiences. And these experiences, I've come to realize, have been informed by race and ethnicity, but also by our class. Like, you know, whether you're struggling to get through the pandemic right now, and also by our gender, because it seems as though we live in a country where we don't recognize that we have a problem with gender inequality until some other breaking news just floods your Facebook page. So my point here is, it's not just about race, and it's not just about ethnicity, but I personally believe that there are people with influence, with power, with responsibility, who polarize us. Such people might be right here. And we continuously perceive that this solidarity does not and cannot exist because of these persons who maybe influence us. But it does exist and it can be nurtured. And I believe that this can be done through dialogue. One second. Yes, I believe this can be done through dialogue. This dialogue would see us engaging with Guyanese, with just regular people, the lady at the shop, the people in your community, the people in your mandirs, your churches, your mosques, etc. In your communities, in your familiar social spaces. We can engage each other in fairly small groups with a facilitator present, and this becomes a space that allows each person to share their own experiences, to express themselves openly, but respectfully. And we can encourage these persons to probe these expressions and really empower them to interrogate their own perceptions and to listen and learn from other people. I extended the conversations I was having with my family to my friends and the members in my community of success, which is probably the other reason why I'm here today. And the experience has been so incredibly illuminating for me. It honestly emphasized to me that solidarity does exist more than we think. And trust me when I tell you, the people who perceive themselves to be so different from one another, they're not that different. They are, but not that different. We share the same, not the same, we share similar feelings, struggles, and hopes. At least that's what I've gathered so far, and that's what I believe. So I'm convinced that this racial and ethnic harmony that we speak about will not be achieved if we continue these top-down approaches and neglecting to engage with people on the ground in communities. It will not be achieved by some person speaking from a podium to a group of people, which is why, again, I think it's really important for us to engage in dialogue in the communities, in the grassroots. We can empower people. We have the opportunity to empower people. Those people who perceive that they're so extremely different from other Guyanese, to express themselves, to listen and to learn from real people. They can interrogate their feelings and maybe even the biases and the perceptions that they might have learned consciously or unconsciously. And we can provide opportunities for people to speak and listen. And we can give them that opportunity to be heard and really uncover that solidarity that we desperately need if we are to heal and move on eventually. So I'm sure at some point or the other you all will agree with me that we need to unload and unpack all of the pain, the hurt, the trauma, the anger, the insecurities, and all those things that have been mentioned that we've been carrying around for a long, long time. At some point we have to interrogate the feelings that we have, the perception that we have, those biases, and other things that we might have learned consciously or unconsciously. At some point, essentially, we just have to heal. And for sure, today alone, we've seen an abundance of solutions on the way forward. But I respectfully submit that dialogue has to be part of the roadmap on the way forward. It is a meaningful attempt and one that can integrate community engagement, which is absolutely necessary. It can't just be a handful of people talking or at the time, a handful of people talking. And who is to say, now today we've seen so many persons speak and provide solutions and all that, who is to say that the engagement we might have in communities with more people, you can't have more solutions, better solutions, widely accepted solutions coming from that engagement? Who's to say that? So I'm almost done. Final thing. Soon after President Ali was inaugurated, I saw an interview with him, I believe it was on the newsroom, and I heard him talking about wanting to start this process of national healing. I look forward to his actions, and I'd like to use the opportunity I have here tonight to say that I look forward to his actions, and I hope that some of the solutions from the conversations we've had here today can make their way to him. For me, the last thing I'd like to say on dialogue is that it might be perceived as this rudimentary idea of just like gaffing with other people, and we could be daunted by the fact that meaningful dialogue will require a lot of resources and a lot of commitment if we are to really go into communities and speak with people all across Guyana. But I encourage you all to think about how we can emphasize inclusiveness and how we can allow ourselves to learn and to heal. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Agabir, for that well put together presentation. I'm looking at the Zoom chat here and I'm very intrigued by the discussion that is going on in there.
Yeah, there's a lot of people sharing points. So actually, we open the floor at this time. If you'd like to add via video, you can also, request to make a comment via video. If it's just speech, just raise your hand in the chat and we'll recognize and give you the opportunity to speak. And also I can invite at this time both Kian and Vishani to join us here at the table so that we can have, a general discussion, because we have a few more questions also coming in that should be addressed. This is for all the speakers, and it seems it just says H-wise. I'm not sure who that person is, but the question to all the speakers: do you think there is an unaddressed emotional component to the ethnic question, or can this issue be solely resolved in a pragmatic and logical approach? So this is for all the speakers, Derwin, Elsie, Vishani.
I am really not sure how to answer that question, because quite honestly, I don't see us having conversations about race and ethnicity without getting, emotional about it, because people they've lost loved ones, they've lost opportunities, they've had their livelihoods destroyed. I really think that we can approach this from, like a I don't know what the pragmatic and logical approach would be. Maybe the person can suggest, but I know there's going to be emotion.
So just to add to what Derwin has said, and in my presentation, I mentioned that, Guyanese people have had these real experiences, these real traumatic experiences, and these experiences perhaps inform how we navigate our daily life here in Guyana. So definitely, I think there's an emotional component to it. I think the issue of itself is quite an emotional one, and we can't really avoid that. And that's not that's not a bad thing. That's incredibly good for us to have these spaces to express our emotions.
Both persons addressed it appropriately, but I think that the question is moot, essentially, because ethnic strife is as a result of your emotions and your feelings to things that have happened to you. So coming all the way back from colonialism to 2020 in Guyana, people have experienced various things, and it's their feelings and reactions to those things that have caused ethnic strife in Guyana.
My question to the panelists is that how do we, as individuals, confront persons of our race, family members, who are outright and publicly racist?
I think you need to just try to talk to people, family members, call them in, try to engage them, understand where they're coming from, and try to help them interrogate what it is that they're saying.
Have small conversations with your family members about some of the problematic things they say. Like, I've heard people, advise me, make sure that when you make children, and I comb the child hair, that the comb don't lash me in my stomach, which is a reference that the child must have, straight hair. I have engaged with people who, there's this one woman that I know, and I'm trying as much as possible not to call out these people's relations, which, would identify them. This one woman I know in particular she's, Afro-Guyanese, and she has a very strong disliking for persons who are Indo-Guyanese, until her daughter, made a child with a guy who was Indo-Guyanese, and she loves this child to bits. It is not to say that their overall ideas change, but she just loves this child. But every day you would find yourself swimming against the tide, trying to correct these problematic ideas that your family have. And in some cases, they're willing. And I know, and I have friends as well who've said to me, I just really talk to my family. And sometimes they listen and sometimes they don't listen. But sometimes they really do grow, maybe over a 2-year, 3-year, 4-year, 5-year period. But don't expect that you can have a conversation one night and the person will wake up and say, oh, well, I'm not racist. And it's just going to cure their mentality and so on. It's an everyday, constant, correcting conversation that has to happen. So when you get ready for do it, make sure you're invested, because it's going to be emotionally burdensome and take up a lot of time as well. So good luck when you're doing it, but just know that it's necessary.
At this point in time, we will end our discussion here this evening. I want to take this opportunity to thank, first and foremost, the Ethnic Relations Commission, the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office, the University of Guyana for making this discussion possible. It is a very necessary discussion for all of us, all Guyanese, young or old.